Okay, so this is a video on morality, basically, in Nietzsche. Um, it's about something that Nietzsche calls master morality and slave morality, which I want to introduce to you, and it's relevant to the way or the reasons why Nietzsche thinks about Christianity the way he does think about it, and that was brought up in the video you just saw. Okay, Christianity is not it's not bad, it's not good, it's a mix, like everything. Christianity had its day, and it pulled something off that Nietzsche would consider useful and beautiful, but he also thinks it's outmoded. So one of the things that will start to get this going is the idea of the free spirit who's supposed to free us, the people of Nietzsche's time, probably still us, from the bondage of the spirit in modern Europe. So this is connected to his view about what philosophy is and what philosophy is supposed to be doing. Now, what sorts of reasons would there be for binding the spirit? So what exactly binds the spirit? Well, for Nietzsche, it's Christianity. It's also democratic Christian culture, which would be kind of the aftermath, the political aftermath of the Christian, particularly the medieval high ages. It would also be science, and it would also be modern moral philosophy. And all these things are covered in sections in Beyond Good and Evil that I didn't have you read. So I'm kind of going to fill some of those details in. You can certainly read that if you want. So I would put it this way. Bondage is what happens when a fiction is not life advancing or life preserving. So you can remember when Nietzsche brought up the question of truth, he says it's not truth that's valuable in itself, but it's for what it does. And so every fiction, if it's life advancing, takes over and leads us on. Okay, so even though there's no such thing as truth or the good, and therefore all morality is just really subjective, it's just the values of some person, it's a autobiography just like philosophy. Nietzsche still, though, believes that some value judgments are superior to others. So this is a kind of a place in his thought where you might not think he's totally consistent about this, and he may not be. He does seem to have views about how the world works. And remember, we talked about the will to power. And he wants to contrast those with views about how we used to think things like morality works and the truth works, okay? But those are just fictions. So they should be understood not as absolutes in their own right, but as working with the will to power at various times in the history of man. Okay, so that takes us to number 260, which is a pretty famous and a pretty important piece that you should read when you're thinking about this. And the idea of two moralities, one called master, one called slave. So we're going to quote extensively from 260 and start at the beginning, where Nietzsche says, in a tour through the many finer and coarser moralities which have hitherto prevailed or still prevail on earth, I found certain traits recurring regularly together and connected with one another until finally two primary types revealed themselves to me, and a radical distinction was brought to light. There is master morality and slave morality. So notice how he's putting this as kind of the conclusion drawn from watching and looking at lots and lots of data. And these sort of emerged out of that. Makes it harder to sort of refute, right? You need to do the work that I've done. Let it at once be noted that in this first kind of morality, the antithesis good and bad means practically the same as noble and despicable. So in master morality, what's good is what's noble. This is not moral good. The noble type of man regards himself as the determiner of values. So what's good is what I think is good. He does not require to be approved of. He passes the judgment. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. So think of the heroes of the Iliad, if you've ever read that work. Okay, so Nietzsche gives them as an example in one place of noble heroes who force themselves on others and physically dominate. So some of the features of a master morality. It's a will to power expressed openly, honestly. And I think by honestly, he just means um, um, it it says what it's going to say. Okay, it doesn't try to hide. Um, Nobly, though exuberant, through exuberant, life-affirming self-creation. It's an aesthetic code. Um, it looks only to the person for value. It's fierce, proud, courageous. What about the slave morality? Well, it is otherwise with the second type of morality. And here he says something very interesting. Supposing that the abused, the oppressed, the suffering, the unemancipated, the weary, and those uncertain of themselves should moralize, what will be the common element in their moral estimates? Probably a pessimistic suspicion with regard to the entire situation of man will find expression. So they'll be pessimistic about the way things are, because of the way things are, they are the ones that are ruled. And they don't think that they want to be the rulers, but they really can't be the rulers. So that's their pessimism. So Nietzsche seems to think that there's a natural kind of superiority in people. Some are better than others. And by better, he doesn't mean morally better. He just means able to dominate the others with their fictions so that those people will follow. Natural leaders, maybe. So they would raising evaluations of the abused and the oppressed, suffering and free, those naturally suited to be led by others to the level of the good. And this would be a morality of suspicion and mistrust of superior people. Okay, the mistrust is they're going to take us over. So we have to figure out a way to make sure that they don't, to sort of keep them in check. So there's an interesting part in this that you didn't read, where Nietzsche compares the saints, the great saints, as they're really these noble men or women who are naturally born to lead, but but Christianity has convinced them that they need to submit themselves, and so they are heroes and they are experts. They are the best at being, in a sense, the worst. And so the free spirit admires the saints because they see fellow travelers, even though they're suspicious of them. Back to 260. Slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. John Stuart Mill's utility. Here is the seat of the origin of the famous antithesis good and evil. So notice that utility. So they're trying to create the best situation for the greatest amount of happiness for the most amount of people, which is something that a naturally born leader doesn't care about. The naturally born leader simply wants to create the best situation for the born leader. Okay, and everything works towards their good and makes them better off. But here it's the group who wants to make the group better off. So maybe that could make some sense to you why utility would be kind of a weak form of Christianity in Nietzsche's mind. So, some of the things about Christianity, Nietzsche says that it's an oppressor of the free spirit. We've just seen that. It's based on fear and resentment of the strong. It is enslavement, self-mockery, and self-mutilation because it demands sacrifice, and it sacrifices freedom and spirit. So it's a bold inversion of the truth, he says in paragraph 46. And it's basically an attempt by slaves to control their masters. Okay, it's the most fatal kind of self-presumption ever. Men not high or hard enough for the artistic refashioning of mankind. Notice that's what a fiction does. Men not noble enough to see the abysmal disparity in order of rank and abysm of rank between man and man. It is such men who, with the equal before God, and let's think of that as their mantra, have hitherto ruled over the destiny of Europe. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is where Nietzsche is not going to just say it's just good or bad. It's not false, because there's no such thing as false, but it's outmoded. Okay, it seems that in Germany, he says, they have no time at all left for religion, i.e. God is dead. To them, the idea of God has lost its full creative force. People believe now in science, technology, and business. So the point is that Christianity and democracy and modern philosophy is no longer relevant to us, no longer life affirming. It's not a viable fiction. So, Nietzsche on human society and individuality. Well, for him, powerful individuals should lead. There should be a master and slave division. At some point, the slaves actually understood how the process worked, and they used it to their own advantage. And it's led by fictions, and the more spiritual, as you've seen, the more powerful. So Plato was one of these powerful individuals. Christianity, as I said, used the same process, but it was the domination of individuals by a group. That's what slave morality is. Okay, this slide talks about some of the things that Nietzsche says about good for humanity versus good for Christians. So the superior individual is good for humanity. Imposes one person imposing themselves on the world and moving the world forward. Christianity, he says, he thinks it's not good in this larger sense, even though it was good at the time. Well, are we happier without God? Well, for Nietzsche, it costs dear and terribly when religions hold sway, not as means of education and breeding in the hands of the philosopher, but in their own right and as sovereign. Modernity continues the slave morality of Christianity without its ultimate sense of purpose. So we have a kind of weaker form, a kind of blander form of group slave morality, without any high purposes to it anymore. Modern scholar who puts down Christianity is a bigger fool because he's trying to, or he or she is trying to defend modern philosophy, which itself is a blander form of a blander fiction than Christianity ever was. So here again, Nietzsche's it's not good or bad. He always takes a little bit of both. But most of us, Nietzsche suggests, don't have the strength of will to be philosophers. Such great minds need to be bred and cultivated. Okay, so philosophy is not philosophy for everyone. Socrates didn't seem to suggest that. But a particular kind of person, the free spirit. Okay, next video we'll look a little bit more back to this free spirit, a little bit of a review, and then set you up for the paper number 5 of this course, which asks you to compare Plato's cave to what you think Nietzsche's cave might look like.